Okay, so hopefully you're keeping up. We are on section 2 of chapter 15. This is a very short chapter, and this section in particular is very short. We're talking about Reconstruction in the South, and then when we get to section 3, it'll be Reconstruction in the North. So your objectives for this section are that you should be able to describe the provisions of the Military Reconstruction Act and the purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau, explain the difference between carpetbaggers and scalawags, list reasons for Southern resentment of Reconstruction, and explain the nature of sharecropping. Make sure that you're taking notes, that you're asking questions, you're putting the information into question and answer form the way you might encounter it on a test. Okay, so originally, I know I told you guys in the last lecture that sometimes Reconstruction is divided up into 3 different time periods. The first time period sometimes is known as Presidential Reconstruction, and there's a few other names also for it, but I think if you remember Presidential Reconstruction, it'll help you remember that this was a time period that was very lenient towards the South because it was President Andrew Johnson who was in charge of it. Also, if you think about Lincoln's 10% plan, another president's plan for Reconstruction, it was also very lenient towards the South. So once the radical Republicans take over Reconstruction, the South originally had some fears about Reconstruction. They thought now, during presidential Reconstruction, that things might not be that bad. But as soon as the radical Republicans take over, they realize it's not going to be so easy. Because if you remember, the radical Republicans are kind of treating the South as a captured enemy, a conquered enemy. They're kind of almost out for blood, right? They're not going to welcome them back kindly. They want to punish them. Or that's kind of going to be the view of the South anyway. So we looked at 2 acts last section. We looked at the Tenure of Office Act, which led to Andrew Johnson's impeachment, and also the Military Reconstruction Act, but we didn't go into details in the last section, and here we'll go into more detail. So the Military Reconstruction Act imposed military occupation on the South. So you had military, pretty much government, federal troops stationed in all of the states in the South. Each state had a military governor. Tennessee was the exemption because Tennessee had ratified the 14th Amendment. So it was considered reconstructed. It was considered that Tennessee had agreed to be back in the Union by pretty much ratifying the 14th Amendment. Now, all these other states, they're divided into 5 military districts with the governor, and they need to create a new state constitution that included universal male suffrage, so meaning any man, any race could vote, and they would have to also ratify the 14th Amendment, and then there's some later legislation that also includes the 15th Amendment. So you can kind of imagine what that would feel like if all of a sudden Las Vegas was being occupied by troops, and that was kind of our police force and our government. Everything was being run by the military. Doesn't really feel like home anymore, right? You would feel like that was an invasion of on your life, okay? So next is the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to provide help to the newly freed slaves. Imagine, none of these people have ever been free before. They don't usually know how to read. They've never been to school. How are they going to get food now? How are they going to get jobs? What are they going to do? Their whole life has been usually on a plantation, and those needs have been met by their owners. So now they have to figure out how to do this for themselves, and the Freedmen's Bureau is going to kind of help support them in that. Oftentimes, the Freedmen's Bureau would override local court decisions, so the white Southerners became resentful of that. There's a time period as well, and it'll go back to it. It'll flip-flop. That black codes were established, and the black codes were pretty much laws or rules that were made that kind of turned things back to slavery. For example, blacks could be arrested for vagrancy more easily than whites. They would prohibit them from voting or holding office, from suing whites, serving on juries. Sometimes they could arrest people, and their penalty would be to go do manual labor on a plantation. So the North and the Freedmen's Bureau and all of these radical Republicans that are coming south to help with Reconstruction view this as pretty much the South trying to reinstitute slavery. So the Freedmen's Bureau is going to try to work to counteract those black codes. Okay. Carpetbaggers, scalawags, these are terms, and not nice terms, for northern radicals that move down south, and that would be a carpetbagger because they put all their stuff into a carpet bag and move south to help participate in radical Reconstruction. Oftentimes, or not oftentimes, I would say the way that they are portrayed oftentimes is as, corrupt, greedy, kind of profiting off of the pain of the South. And then Southern radicals, so people that were born in the South but sympathized with the North and were now going to participate in radical Reconstruction, were called scalawags. Okay, so let's evaluate what Reconstruction rule was like in the South. There was quite a bit of corruption, but you should also know that there's quite a bit of corruption in the North, and we're going to talk about that in the next chapter. It's not restricted to the South and how Northerners are governing the South. The Northerners themselves in their own states are incredibly corrupt, and we'll talk about President Grant and some of the scandals associated with his administration. But there were some good things as well. So schools were established. You have suffrage, meaning the right to vote. That's expanded to include all males. Roads are built and improved, repaired. Unfortunately, you have a lot of reliance, the radical government's relying on the military's force to make sure that people are following the rules. Pretty much you have a government that's being imposed on a majority, against the will of the majority in the South. So that's difficult, a difficult situation. And you also have the disfranchisement, meaning they can't vote, they're not allowed to vote, of a lot of these Southern whites, because they had been in the Confederate Army, and under radical Reconstruction they weren't allowed to vote. So you have a lot of people, the majority of people in the South, feeling like they don't have a voice in their own home. So they are going to become very resentful. Imagine if that were you. You would be resentful. You would be angry. Okay, so some of this anger leads to groups, extremist groups like the Ku Klux Klan rising up. The Ku Klux Klan, most of you are familiar with them, used threats, beating, murder, usually to intimidate blacks from voting or from doing anything they really didn't like. They, also not just blacks, but they would intimidate some of those carpetbaggers and scalawags, and those types of people. The Ku Klux Act will be issued, and that will help break up the Klan for a time, and then we'll see again later on in history there'll be a reemergence of the Klan. The Klan will also target Catholics, immigrants, Jews, because it pretty much it's a white supremacist group. Their leader, the actual founder, I guess we would call him, of the Ku Klux Klan, was Nathan Bedford Forrest. He was one of the generals that we've talked about in the Civil War. And actually, there's, I don't know if it's still up, but there was controversy a few years ago because I think it was a university or a school had a statue of him. And, the controversy was, how could you have a statue of someone who established this hate group? And then at the same time, there's people arguing that he was this great Civil War leader, and honoring that heritage. Okay, so because the South has been pretty much destroyed because of the Civil War, think also like the land, right? You have the slaves being freed. There's not necessarily people working the land. The economic system needs to repair itself, and agriculture is going to remain the primary industry of the South. But now how do we figure out this wage system? How are we going to pay people? How are we going to pay, do we hire slaves? How does this all work? So sharecropping is developed. Sharecropping pretty much is you would get the use of some land, so you kind of be leasing that land from a landlord, and you would be allowed to live on that land in exchange for your labor. So you would work that piece of land, Usually, it's the South. They want to plant cash crops, so you're planting cotton, tobacco, and you'd give a percentage of that to your landlord. A lot of times you'd have to purchase things on credit. Imagine if one of your years, your crops went bad, and then you'd have to purchase, food and supplies from your landlord on credit. So you kind of always owe your landlord, and it kind of is just this cycle of debt that a lot of people can't escape. And in a way, it's kind of a new slavery. Finally, we have the third phase of Reconstruction. So remember, you had presidential, you had radical Reconstruction, and now you have redemption Reconstruction. Sometimes it's called Bourbon Reconstruction. And this is a return to majority rule. So the South is no longer occupied by the military, and you have the white Southerners coming back into power. And then you'll see, the black codes come up again. Blacks not being allowed to vote, and not within like a state constitution, it wouldn't say that, but usually there would be some kind of poll tax or literacy test that would purposely be targeted towards having blacks fail them or not be able to pay them so that they couldn't vote. Okay, here's your paragraph shrink. And here's the SRQ. Hopefully you're caught up over this next week before we go on to Missions Week. If you need help, you have any questions, please ask me. Our unit test will probably be next Thursday.